Well, hello, Nativity Bible heads. It is Dr. Wayne, and this is your Bible Study Wednesday. I hope everybody is ready to rock and roll on this 1 Kings chapters 6 and 7. I tell you what, if you read through it already, you might wonder, what could you possibly say about that? Yeah, what do we get in chapters 6 and 7 of 1 Kings? We get a description of the temple and Solomon's palace. Let's begin chapter 6 of 1 Kings, verse 1. In the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. The house of the Lord is a euphemism for temple. Now, don't confuse it with the house of Solomon. The house of Solomon will be the one that he lives in. It's bigger, the palace. But here we have a chronology, if you will, that differs from the chronology that we might find in, like, for example, the Greek version of 1 Kings, but it's the one that the writer of 1 Kings gives us. Remember, we're trying to look at Scripture from as a narrative, and we want to get into the world of what the narrator is creating for us, okay? Verse 2. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. So, what's a cubit? Okay, here's what a cubit is. Very scientific. It's the length from the tip of your elbow to the tip of your longest finger. Yes, that's right. Is that different for different people? I can't. There we go. The whole thing there. Yeah, the tip of your elbow to the tip of your longest finger. Typically, it's 18 inches, a foot and a half, something like that. All of this is intended to be comparative to what we found back in Exodus with the description of the tabernacle. Do you remember that? The tabernacle was that mobile tent structure that they would build and tear down going through the wilderness. Now, the temple is twice as big as the tabernacle. Symbolic, indeed. Okay, verse 3. The vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits wide across the width of the house. Its depth was 10 cubits in front of the house. For the house he made windows with recessed frames. He also built a structure against the wall of the house, running around the walls of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary, and made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits wide, the middle one was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide. For around the outside of the house he made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beams should not be inserted into the walls of the house. So what we get in this whole thing is like, there's a lot of technical jargon in the Hebrew that we don't see a lot of, and so it's difficult to give an English interpretation or translation that coincides with what we know, architecturally. And so if you were an architecture person and you were reading this, you'd have to have a lot of artistic license to put it together. I highly recommend, if you really want to see what it could look like, go to the Google, go to YouTube, type in Solomon's Temple. You're going to find videos that are going to create what it could look like or could have looked like, along with some will have narration, some won't. But if you really want to get an idea of what it would look like, you would need to do that. Now, our narrator is trying to paint a picture of opulence, of create a sense of, wow, isn't this amazing kind of thing. So he's not recounting the details because of the thinking that, well, one of these days they might want to rebuild it or something. No, he wasn't thinking of that. He's trying to create a sense of awe, a sense of wonder, a sense of like, whoa, this is big. Yeah. Verse 7, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7. The house was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the temple while it was being built. This was a big deal about the temple because of the fact that finished stones requires a lot of noisy work. And apparently there was a high value placed on no tools being used in the construction of it. And that all of the honing and the shaping and the buffing and what have you of the stones was done away from the air. The idea is intended to create a sense of reverence for the building and its intended purpose. Verse 8. The entrance for the middle story was on the south side of the house. One went up by the winding stairs to the middle story, and from the middle story to the third. So he built the house and finished it. He roofed the house with beams and planks of cedar. We learned about the cedar earlier when he struck a deal with the king of Tyre. Remember those cedars of Lebanon? Yes, well, he had to get that. He had to import that. Verse 10, he built the structure against the whole house, each story 5 cubits high, and it was joined to the house with timbers of cedar. Not exactly 100% sure, nobody is, exactly what what he's trying to describe here, but it looks like, it seems as though the building itself had an outcropping building around it of 3 stories with staircases in between and used for, I don't know, storage, stuff like that. Again, the intention here is not so that it can be recreated. It's we are supposed to be overwhelmed. I hope that's how you feel. Continue. Verse 11. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon. And in all of these descriptions, this is in chapters 6 and 7, this is the only time we actually hear the Lord speak, okay? Concerning this house, this is the voice of the Lord here, starting in verse 12, 1 Kings chapter 6. Concerning this house that you are building, if you will walk in my statutes, obey my ordinances, and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will establish my promise with you, which I made to your father David. I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. Okay, this is what we would call, in the world of the narrator, the deuteronomistic voice, okay? Yes, it is the voice of the Lord, and these verses, 11, 12, and 13, encapsulate the overall theology that we've had since Deuteronomy started. Remember, the deuteronomistic history is that history from Deuteronomy, it goes through Joshua, and Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And it is intended to, it states over and over again, so, if you keep my statutes and ordinances, everything's going to go great. But if you backslide, not so much. This is a reiteration of that because we know how it's going to end, okay? This temple that's being built is not the same temple that Jesus saw. The temple that was there when Jesus was there was one that was built later. It was the second temple. This is the first temple. There is no third temple. No third temple got built. Remember, it's now been, there's the Temple of the Rock. The Muslim, can't think of the name of the Dome of the Rock. Yes, that big gold dome you see when you see a picture of Israel. That's where that is. There is no temple there now. So remember, our narrator knows that there will be a time when it is no more. So therefore, we want to get an appreciation for what it was so that we can know what was lost. Verse 14. So Solomon built the house and finished it. So when it says Solomon built the house and finished it, it doesn't mean that he did it himself, okay? We can't take it literally. It simply is a way of saying that he's the one that was in charge, and yeah, he contracted it out. So if you want to get literal about it and think of Solomon as some master build, no, that's not what's going on here. Verse 15. He lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar. From the floor of the house to the rafters of the ceiling, he covered them on the inside with wood, and he covered the floor of the house with boards of cypress. He built 20 cubits of the rear of the house with boards of cedar from the floor to the rafters, and he built this within as an inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. Remember, the tabernacle had it was a big rectangle, basically. And in it, there was this entryway, and then there was this Holy of Holies place, the inner sanctuary, and that's where the priest went for with the incense and all of that. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. The invisible, the seat of the invisible God. Not that God was there, but that's the invisible God would sit upon the wings of the cherubim on top of the tabernacle, or of the Ark of the Covenant. So, verse 17. The house, that is, the nave in front of the inner sanctuary, was 40 cubits long. The cedar within the house had carvings of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar. No stone was seen. See, the idea of it was that there was stone that was at the base. It was overlaid with wood, and then that wood was then overlaid with gold. Like I told you, if you want to imagine what that looked like, go to the Google. I just did, and yeah. There's all kinds of different artistic renditions of it. But these things with the carvings of gourds and open flowers, this is all designed to represent the very, open flowers. It's like this nature and wonderfulness and opulence. All of this is what we are supposed to get from this. Oh, the idea. Notice the thing about it mentioned the nave. In our churches, in the Episcopal Church anyway, we call that area where all the people in the pews, we call that the nave, okay? And then we call the front up behind the altar rail, typically where the choir is, not necessarily the nativity, but that's where the ordained people are, called the sanctuary, kind of like the holy. That's where our table is, right? Our altar table and such. Well, there's a reason why our churches are built in that way. There is a modeling that was started with that which we find with the temple. And here it is. Verse 20. The interior of the inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. A perfect box, right? He overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid the altar with cedar. Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold. And then he drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. Next, he overlaid the whole house with gold in order that the whole house might be perfect. Perfect. that idea of perfect, that idea of complete, okay? Even the whole altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary, he overlaid with gold. Just an opulent picture, yes? Verse 23. In the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub, 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. The other cherub also measured 10 cubits. Both cherubim had the same measure and the same form. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was that of the other cherub, but he put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house. The wings of the cherubim were spread out so that the wing of the one was touching the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub was touching the other wall. Their other wings toward the center of the house were touching wing to wing. He also overlaid the cherubim with gold. So, what's a cherub? Okay. A cherub is a human-faced winged creature. Okay? That's the best way to describe it. You've seen the little Cupid dolls, the little Cupids that you see, the little babies with the wings. That's kind of like the way it's kind of got stylized today. But a cherub, okay, cherub is the singular. In Hebrew, you don't to pluralize cherub, you don't add an S like in English, cherubs. No, you don't. You add an im. Im, it's the masculine plural of cherub, as opposed to the masculine feminine, or the feminine plural, which is ot, O-T-H, which you also see in Hebrew. But cherubim is the plural of cherub, not cherubs. There you go, Hebrew. Okay, verse 29. He carved the walls of the house all about with carved engravings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms. The floor of the house he overlaid with gold in the inner and the outer rooms. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 5-sided. Some people think that means it's like an inset, okay? There were 4 sides, there were 4 insets for the outer doors, 5 for the one going into the innermost, the inner sanctuary. If you can imagine, it's kind of like a beveling. A beveling, B-E-V-E-L, a bevel, 5 levels of bevel, 5 levels of bevel. Verse 32, he covered the 2 doors of olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. Palm trees and open flowers are very they symbolize fertility and opulence and the glory of nature. It's a little bit in that nature. You know the little birds and bees things when you talk about flowers, open flowers. Yeah, okay, that's where you're kind of going there. It's a bit of a symbol of posterity, if you will, posterity and prosperity. Okay. All right, spread the gold on the cherubim on the palm trees. Verse 33. Let's go there. So also he made for the entrance to the nave doorposts of olive wood, 4-sided each, and 2 doors of cypress wood. The 2 leaves of one door were folding, and the 2 leaves of the other door were folding. He carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, overlaying them with gold evenly applied upon the carved work. He built the inner court with 3 courses of dressed stone to the 1 course of cedar beams. Yeah. Again, if you want to think, if you see what it looks like, go to the YouTube. It's hard to. If our narrator thought it was important that we could see it, it would have drawn us a picture. Could they have done? Yeah, they could have done it, but that's not what he chose to do, now did he? Verse 37. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. In the 11th year, so that means it took like 7 years to build, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts and according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. Okay, kind of a symbolic representation, if you will. I don't think it's just a coincidence that it took 7 years. Look here, chapter 7. Solomon was building his own house 13 years. That's the hinge onto, he's going to talk about his own, we're going to find about Solomon's temple. And he finished his entire house. So even though it took longer, that's because it was a lot bigger. It's symbolic. Is symbolic in that, the narrator gives us, or gave us, much greater detail, if you will, of the temple than we get of the palace. Okay, the palace. Here we go. Verse 2, chapter 7, verse 2. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 2. He built the house of the forest of the Lebanon, 100 cubits long. That's kind of like the name of, that's kind of like what he called that, the main corridor, the main, I don't know what you call it, but the main area of the palace, the house of the forest of Lebanon. 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. Yes, it was bigger than the temple. It was roofed with cedar on the 45 rafters, 15 in each row, which were on the pillars. There were window frames in the 3 rows, facing each other in the 3 rows. All the doorways and the doorposts had 4-sided frames. 4-sided frames again. Remember that 4 levels of bevel. Beveled 4 times. Opposite, facing each other in the 3 rows. Verse 6. He made the hall of pillars 50 cubits long and 30 cubits wide. There was a porch in front with pillars and a canopy in front of them. He made the hall of the throne, this is in another room, where he was to pronounce judgment. The hall of justice, another name for the hall of the throne. You know, you have these pictures of kings, you know, with their throne. It's an elevated, well, that's what it's describing. Covered with cedar from floor to floor. His own house, where he would reside in the other court, back of the hall, was of the same construction. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. Oh, really? Not surprising that the descriptions we see here of the temple and of the palace where he lived, very similar to a lot of stuff that we would see in Egypt and Assyria and in that area around there in that day and age. Okay? This wasn't an original construction, if you will. Okay, verse 9, 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 9. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with saws back and front, which means no jagged edges, from the foundation to the coping, and from outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits. There were costly stones above, cut to measure, and cedar wood. The great court had 3 courses of dressed stone to 1 layer of cedar beams all around. So had the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibule of the house. Remember, all this is intended to just have us say, we're supposed to be like overwhelmed with it. So if you feel like, there's a lot to take in, that's the experience you're supposed to have. Verse 13. Now King Solomon invited and received Hiram from Tyre. Now this isn't King Hiram of Tyre. This is a different Hiram. In fact, in the book of Chronicles, his name is Huram-Abi. Okay, we already heard about a Hiram of Tyre who was a king that King Solomon dealt with. No, this is not him. This is, well, look, verse 14 tells us who he is. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, one of those northern tribes, which is near Tyre, whose father, a man of Tyre, had been an artisan in bronze. He was full of skill, intelligence, and knowledge in working bronze. He came to King Solomon and did all his work. So just as Moses used, there was an artisan craftsman, I can't remember the guy's name now, that was involved in the building of the tabernacle. Solomon has a craftsman skilled in working bronze do that for him, for his palace. Verse 15. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of the one, and a cord of 12 cubits would encircle it. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. There were nets of checker work with wreaths of chain work for the capitals on the top of the pillars, 7 for one capital and 7 for the other. He made the columns with 2 rows around each lattice work to cover the capitals that were above the pomegranates. He did the same with the other capital. Now, the capitals that were on the top of the pillar in the vestibule were of lily work, 4 cubits high. The capitals were on the 2 pillars and also above the rounded projection that was beside the lattice work. There were 200 pomegranates in rows all around, and so with the other capital. He set up the pillars, he set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south, and he called it Yakin. And he set up the pillar on the north and called it Boaz. And if you look at your handy dandy little footnote, it's going to tell you that those names, Yakin means he will establish, referring to God's initiative in establishing the throne. And Boaz, meaning by his strength. He will establish by his strength, expresses, the king's dependence on the divine favor. So what we have here are 2 pillars at the entrance. And you're supposed to be overwhelmed by all this. Pomegranates also, ooh, fertility. Have you ever opened up a pomegranate, seen all those seeds? Yeah, prosperity and posterity they represent. Verse 23, then he made the molten sea. What's the molten sea? The molten sea is basically a big tub. It's a big tub, and it's not a constructed tub. It is a cast tub, which means that it wasn't constructed. It's all one piece, okay? The molten sea was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high. A line of 30 cubits would encircle it completely. Under its brim were panels all around it. Each of 10 cubits surrounding the sea, there were 2 rows of panels cast when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen. Oh, that's interesting. Can you picture this big thing? 3 facing north, 3 facing the west, 3 facing the south, 3 facing the east. The sea was set on them, so it's like this big bowl on the backs of 12 oxen facing in 4 directions. And if you've ever seen or heard anybody describe the baptistry in a Mormon temple, looks a lot like this. The hindquarters of each were toward the inside. So it's basically saying that their heads were facing out. Its thickness was a hand breadth. Its brim was made like the brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It held 2,000 baths. Now, a bath was a measure of volume. Not exactly we're not exactly sure how much, but it's a lot. It's a big bowl. That's a big bowl of water. The water was used for the different ablutions that the priests would need. But anyway, we continue. Verse 27. He also made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 40 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. This was the construction of the stands. They had borders. The borders were within the frames. On the borders that were set in the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames, both above and below the lions and the oxen, there were wreaths of beveled work. Oh, there's that word bevel. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze. So these are like little carts, if you will, that were used to transport water from the big bowl, the molten sea. At the 4 corners were supports for a basin. The supports were cast with wreaths at the side of each. Its opening was within the crown, whose height was 1 cubit. Its opening was round as a pedestal is made. It was 1.5 cubits wide. Now, did you notice how the description of Solomon's palace was very brief, and then we went back to the peripheral stuff around the temple. So we're back to the furnishings. The palace was just verses 1 through 12. Starting in verse 13, we switch back to what's around the temple, but not the temple itself, the furnishings around it, the things that were used around it. Okay, I just want to make sure we're clear on what's going on here. Verse 30, each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze. At the 4 corners were supports for a basin. See, so they toted water. The supports were cast with wreaths at the side of each. Its opening was within the crown, whose height was 1 cubit. Its opening was round, as a pedestal is made, and it was 1.5 cubits wide. At its opening there were carvings. Its borders were 4-sided, not round. The 4 wheels were underneath the borders. The axles of the wheels were in the stands, and the height of the wheel was 1.5 cubits. These are carts. The wheels were made like a chariot wheel. Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast. See, that's a big deal that something is cast. It's like means that it was made by pouring it into a mold as opposed to being constructed. Verse 34. It kind of gives a tenor of integrity, if you will, and something that's that big, that's cast, means it's just that much. It's got a lot more integrity, if you will. Verse 34. There were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each stand. The supports were of one piece with the stands. On the top of the stand, there was a round band, 0.5 cubit high. On the top of the stand, its stays and its borders were of one piece with it. On the surfaces of its stays and on its borders, he carved cherubim, lions, and palm trees, where each had space with wreaths all around. In this way, he made the 10 stands. All of them were cast alike with the same size and the same form. Verse 38. He made 10 basins of bronze. Each basin held 40 baths. Remember, that's a measure of a volume of water. Each basin measured 4 cubits, and there was a basin for each of the 10 stands. He set 5 of the stands on the south side of the house, 5 on the north side of the house, and he set the sea on the southeast corner of the house. So this is talking about the house of the Lord, okay? Hiram, remember, he's that bronze guy from Tyre. Hiram also made the pots, the shovels, and the basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars, the 2 lattice works to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the top of the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works, 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the pillars, the 10 stands, the 10 basins of the stands, the 1 sea, and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. Verse 45. The pots, the shovels, and the basins, all these vessels that Hiram made for King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of burnished bronze. That's what he did. In the plain of the Jordan, the king cast them. So, look at this. In the clay ground between Sukkot and Zarethan. So yeah, what they would do is the clay of the ground, they would just carve it out of that since it was already there, and that's where they would pour the molten bronze, and that's where they would get their cast for making these things. Verse 47, Solomon left all the vessels unweighed because there were so many of them. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Remember, the idea here is to create a sense of opulence, to blow your mind. And that's the reason why we don't have, it's like, it was just too much. We couldn't even measure it. It was so much, okay? We are supposed to be blown away. Verse 48. So Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north, in the front of the inner sanctuary, the flowers, the lamps, and the tongs of gold, the cups, the snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, and fire pans of pure gold, the sockets for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the nave of the temple of gold. Yeah. Solomon did the stuff with the gold. Hiram did the stuff with the bronze. Okay? Yeah. He gets top dog. Verse 51. Thus, all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. Solomon brought in the things that his father David had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. So that refers to some things from back in Samuel when David... remember, David is the one who made Jerusalem the capital, the religious capital and political capital of the nation. Now all that stuff gets a place to stay. Now, in the building of the temple, we have reached the midpoint of, not time-wise, but the theological midpoint, if you will, of the narrative arc of what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. This was about 960 in BCE, before the Common Era, about 960. So remember, we always want to think of David as around 1000. So this building was like 960. The theological point of all of this is that, remember, the promise that they were led out of Egypt with was that there was a place for them. And remember, the sign that the Lord would do all of that was that they would worship him where? On that mountain. And now that they have taken possession of the land that was promised to Abraham, the tabernacle gets related into terms of a temple. And the temple is, it sounds a lot like what the tabernacle looked like, in as far as shape and with the gold overlay of everything. Now, in the history of Israel, the temple takes on a meaning that it's one of those things that's like a two-edged sword, okay? It's like, okay, yeah, it's a good thing that they got it. It represents that they've gotten themselves somewhere, but it's also the beginning of the end, because as we read in Kings later on, there are going to be other kings that are going to start introducing things to the temple that's not so pure. They're going to start looting stuff, start breaking up stuff of the temple, one king steals those bowls that the big molten sea was the bowl, that big water bowl, that's the 12 oxen. He actually uses the precious metal that they're made of for another use. So it starts to get salvaged for parts, if you will. So this represents, though, a midpoint. Yeah, it's a height of something, of like, oh, wow, looks like we made it, but it's also the beginning of the end, because it goes downhill from here. And we're going to start to see that as it proceeds. But in the building of it, we're supposed to have a sense of reverence, a sense of awe, a sense of like, oh, this is huge. Because when it all gets destroyed, in a few hundred years, it's going to be, it's like, wow, really, that was the way that was? How? Weren't we good? So that's where we are. And next week in chapter 8 and of chapters 8 and following, I don't know if we're going to do 2 chapters, probably just 8. It's probably just 8. But we will actually get this place, this physical structure inaugurated, if you will, and for use. And it's a great ceremony. So that's what we're off to next time. Remember, though, the temple for the early church, remember, represented an overreach on the side of humanity in presuming that God could be limited by what was in this physical space. I remember I said it's the midpoint. It's like it's as though we talk about sometimes putting God in a box, how sometimes we will limit God. Sometimes these holy places that we build to represent something start to be a confining element in the way we think about God. And as it turns out, that's how it worked for Israel. Because remember, in the early church, Remember in Acts when Stephen is getting stoned, he talks about the temple as being like, the temple, pooey on the temple. We don't need no stinking temple. The temple that God truly dwelt in was the temple that was the Messiah, Jesus, the Christ. And that was the most important thing for the early church. So this glorification of it on the other side, it starts to see oh, the buildings, yeah, are they important? Are they useful? Yeah, but do they limit our experience of God? No. Can they limit our experience of God? Yes, if we go the wrong direction in our minds with regard to it. So that's our lesson for today. So join us next week in 1 Kings chapter 8 when we will inaugurate this temple. And in the meantime, keep reading your Bible.